So hello, good morning to you all. I hope you had a good evening last night. Welcome to this second day of the EDULOG's International Conference. With no delays, I'll try to introduce Professor Hans de Wit. Hans de Wit, I think it's the form of pronunciation, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce him. He's a leading scholar in the internationalization of higher education. His research focuses on global learning, the future of international post-COVID, and student mobility beyond Anglophone countries. From 2015 to 2020, he was the director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College and has also held leadership roles in Milan and Amsterdam. He's currently a senior fellow at the International Association of Universities based at UNESCO, and in 2022 received the Professor Noam Chomsky North Star Lifetime Achievement Award from the Star Scholars Network. So please welcome Hans de Wit.
Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me by the foundation. It's really a pleasure to be here and to talk to you about changing rationales for the internationalization of higher education, focusing basically on why are we internationalizing higher education and why are we having international students as part of that whole enterprise. And I will address three big themes. What are the different perceptions, meanings, and rationales for internationalization, and do we see over time changing paradigms in this whole notion of what is internationalization of higher education? What have been the main trends over the years, and what will be the future direction? Of course, it's very difficult to look into the future, certainly in the current geopolitical, complicated and troubled times that we are facing. But it's important to try to understand what might be happening in higher education and its international dimensions. And in that whole discussion, I also will focus on what does it mean for international students, the main topic of this event. When we talk about internationalization, we have to keep in mind that it's a very multifaceted and constantly evolving process. Internationalization, in my view, even doesn't mean anything, while it means at the same time everything. And that's the contradiction. So if I ask people in this room what internationalization means, I probably get a completely different answer than if I would ask it in Africa, or if I would ask it in the United States, if I would ask it in the UK, or in Asia, because context and perceptions differ, and it also differs by different types of stakeholders, and it changes all over time. When I started in internationalization of higher education in 1981, so a very long time ago, as you can imagine, internationalization in the Netherlands, my home country, didn't even exist as a term, but it had also mainly the focus on development cooperation in higher education. There was no active exchange of students, etc. It was basically, we helped universities in developing countries. 10 years later, that already changed because of the Erasmus time, etc. And I come back to that historical development later. But so, it is an evolving process, and it is a multifaceted process. And the same applies to other terms that we use in the context of internationalization. When we talk about global citizenship, people have different meanings. When we talk about transnational or cross-border education, There are many different dimensions of that and types and meanings of it. When we talk about digitalization in internationalization, there are many different focuses on it. When we talk about the topic of internationalization at home, there are many different perceptions and definitions and concepts about that. And the same applies also to international students, and I come back to that. So internationalization is not one model that fits all. It is defined by the institutional context, by the local context, by the national context, by the global context. And so it changes constantly in response to the changing of the environment in which it is going to happen. And that makes it essential to look at why are we, institutions, governments, professors, departments, programs, why are we internationalizing, and what would be the intended outcomes and the realized outcomes of that question of why we are doing it. So that's the essence of what you do. And that applies also to the international student. There is not such a thing as the international student. Interesting, like with internationalization, we use constantly the term, and even in this title of our conference, we use the term international students. But as yesterday already was said by Simon, there are different types of international students. There are the most commonly distinction is between degree-seeking students and credit-seeking students. So degree is when you do a complete study for bachelor, master, or PhD abroad, and credit mobility, credit international students will mean that you do part of your studies abroad for credits at your home institution. That is still a common understanding. But there's more. I mean, there's also what we call certificate-seeking international students. That's students that go for a specific purpose, to get a certificate for either language, foreign language training, or for specialization in their field, or for personal development, etc. That's probably even the largest movement of students around the world, but you have no data about that because it's not very well organized. So we have more data, and even that is already questionable, as has been said yesterday, about degree-seeking and credit-seeking students. So that's another one. Then there's the refugee students that we were talking about yesterday, which are international students not because they choose to go abroad, but they were forced to go abroad. And that's another type. Then we have the whole issue of virtual students. If you do a virtual study abroad, so you don't move even, but you are an international student because you are taking a course virtually, you can do it either as a credit or you can do it again as a full degree. So is that an international student in our definitions or not? That's not really clear, and how to measure that is even more complicated than with the other categories. There is, of course, the geographical factor. We have north-north mobility, we have south-north mobility, we have south-south mobility, we have also a little bit of north-south mobility, and they are all, again, mixing with the different types of mobility as well. And there's another category which is not in this slide, because I assumed that Nigel Healy would talk about that in his presentation, which unfortunately was cancelled, is transnational education. Transnational education, also, by the way, a term that many people have different meanings about. Sometimes they include mobility of students and mobility of faculty, but in reality, mostly it is focused on mobility of programs and projects and institutions. You have all kinds of different types of transnational education. You have branch campuses, which are the most commonly known, but at the same time probably the smallest proportion of transnational education. Something like 300 branch campuses there are. You have franchise operations, so higher education operating the same way as Starbucks and McDonald's, where you transfer your program to another institution. They manage the program, you only do the quality control of the heating of the coffee and the heating of the program. So that's another form. You have articulation programs, you have all kinds of different type of activities in transnational education. And if you relate that to what is an international student, it becomes even more complicated. Because let's take the example of a branch campus. Is a local student in, let's say, Singapore, at an Australian branch campus, is that an international student or is it a local student? It's probably both, because you get it at home, but at the same time you get your degree from another institution. Is it for an Australian student who goes to study in the branch campus in Singapore? Is it a local student or is it an international student or is it both? And if you are an international student at the Australian branch campus in Singapore, you're both double international. So also that makes what we define as being an international student quite complicated. Then there is the issue of funding. Still there is a perception that most international students are studying abroad with a scholarship. The reality is it's only a very small percentage, probably less than 5%. So most students fund themselves by either families or by loans from local banks or foreign banks, by working, etc. So that also has to keep in mind. And then there is the question, why are students going abroad? There's not one answer to that either. You can go abroad because you fell in love with a girl or a boy in the other country, and then you become an international student. You can do it because you want to go and work in that other country, and you think if you do your study there, you can probably have a better chance to work abroad. You can do it because you want to get a better qualification than you get at your home country, and you're going to work there. So we constantly have to ask ourselves, what do we mean when we talk about an international student, and why are they doing this, and what is the intended impact and outcome of what they're doing? And although it's very important and very welcome that the work that UNESCO and OECD and others, Eurostat, etc., do about the mobility of the numbers, and that gives us an idea about what are trends, etc., we as scholars and we as practitioners working in higher education always have to ask ourselves, but what is this international student, and why is that international student here, and what does that mean for what we yesterday called integration, but better term, as Elspeth said, belonging? What does that mean for belonging? So that is different. If you are coming for 3 months as an Erasmus student, your feeling of belonging is quite different than if you are doing a 4-year bachelor degree. So you also have to keep that in mind. So we have always asked ourselves again, why are we doing and what is the intended outcome and how that relates to what our policies and strategies are. But again, back to the broader context of internationalization, but it implies also to international students, we always mix these questions. We mix the question, why are we doing this, with what are we doing, how are we organizing it, what is the intended outcomes of it, with whom are we talking, and where are we talking. Those all are important dimensions, but you have to be clear, what are you talking about? And unfortunately, over all those many years that I have been involved in assessing and advising on strategies of internationalizations, the question why is very little asked. There is a kind of general term, oh, we do it because everybody else does it, so for instance, in recruitment of international students, so we have to do that. Or we want to be high in the rankings, or we want to have a nice trip as a rector to go abroad, and so we sign an agreement, all those kind of things. But really asking yourself why in your country, in your institution, for your specific program, you are doing this is very essential for developing a strategy. And always keeping in mind intended outcomes, which we also not do. We do this kind of things without looking into what are the possible risks, what are the possible challenges, what are the possible opportunities, what impact it will have not only on the institution, but on the student, on the country, etc. And if you don't do that, then the question what becomes very marginal. But most of the organizations and the institutions are focusing basically on, oh, we're going to recruit international students, or we're going to send our students abroad, or we're doing research. Because that's what everybody does. And how do we do that? Okay, we bring some money in, or we set up an international office. All are very important, But you cannot do that strategically wise when you're not first asking yourself, why are we doing this? So rationales are very important. And again, there's not one answer to that question, why. In general, in the literature, mainly by my colleague Jay Knight and myself and others, we identify 4 broad categories of rationales. There are political rationales, why you have to internationalize. There are economic ones, there are socio-cultural ones, and there are educational, academic ones. But even within those, there are quite sometimes contradicting ones. So in the political, and I come back to that later, it can be that it is very important for governments to have collaboration and education as a starting point to establish political and diplomatic contacts, which was, for instance, the case when the United States started with China. They first started to develop agreements for cooperation. The same happened with, after the fall of the Soviet Union. We wanted to have establishment of improving the contacts with Russia. So that was foreign policy, there's soft power, but there's also issues of national security. You want to be secure that how you collaborate. So again, a lot of factors there. Economic, it can be because it's important for the labor market, so you have to prepare your students that they are capable to work in a much more international economic environment. You can do it as revenue generation. We discussed that yesterday, like in Australia, it's after mining the second export product of the country. So, and even for institutions, the UK the same, as Sylvie has said. You can do it for either skills development, you can do it for all kinds of different reasons. And then there's the social and cultural part, the personal development, the soft skills, development of intercultural competence. And then on the education academic side is, of course, it's quality assurance, research cooperation, positions and rankings, all those kind of factors also are there. So there are all kinds of different rationales you have to keep in mind. But they are always a mix. So you always have to look into what is the different stakeholder that defines the answer to the why, but also there are probably more answers when you have as a government or an institution or a program why you're doing this. But you have to be clear about what do you mean. And they shift over time, as I mentioned. I mean, the rationales might shift by institutions, by governments over time because the context changes. And that's, I keep telling that context in internationalization still is very much more important than people say. It is very different. I mean, if I look at what is internationalization at, I would now say, I always use the example Harvard, but Harvard is now in a very difficult position, unfortunately, with internationalization, even announcing that they will not be allowed to have international students. But before that, Harvard had an international strategy by the fact that they didn't have an international strategy. They just said, well, we are the greatest, we are the best, and so by that we are international. 5 miles from Harvard is Boston College, which is a Jesuit institution, very much focused on social justice, so their internationalization strategy is embedded into a different context again. So each institution has to look into why they are doing it in a different way within their mission and vision and strategy, and the same applies to countries, etc. And then stakeholders can have a different perception. A student can have a different rationale why to go abroad than the program has or than the institution has. A government can have a completely different rationale than an institution has. Again, what we see now happening. So they are, again, key rationales, and related to that, because the rationale why you are doing this must be clearly defined by what you want to get out of it, otherwise you have not an answer to that question why. They are very essential for strategies for internationalization in higher education institutions, and we should be much more aware about that than the reality is. And to give the historical example of what happens with the dominant rationales in that context. So after World War II and during the Cold War, the political rationale was pretty dominant. Institutions really were much more passive actors in internationalization. It was basically governments and international organizations that defined that it was very important to have an international dimension. It was basically training the elites from the colonies and the former colonies and the Cold War period for their capacity building. So South-North mobility was important in that sense for a small group. There was what I mentioned before in the 80s, development cooperation, and aid was a very important factor in political rationales. National security was at that time, it comes back as I will say, was also a very important factor. The Soviet Union, the United States, less Europe, were really seeing internationalization as part of a national security issue, to be dominant and to keep their control about what is happening in the world, etc. Soft power related to that was very important. So there was not really a strategic thinking in most of the universities about internationalization until the second half of the 1980s, when we saw what I call a period of hope happening. There was this, particularly in Europe, but also to a certain extent in the United States, there was this idea where we have to collaborate. We have to exchange students, we have to have research collaboration. You had, of course, the start of the Erasmus program and the framework programs for research. You had the stimulus of the study abroad in the United States and signing of agreements. So that was one way of how the educational factor became driving. But at the same time, we had Australia and the UK, and it has been mentioned yesterday, which already around 1980 shifted from development aid to trade, so introducing full cost fee. That later, in the, around the turn of the century, became much more dominant in the rest of the world as well, but already in the UK and Australia, that was an important factor. And I still remember from those times when the UK and Australia will do that, people would say, well, oh, there will be no international students going to Australia and UK anymore because it's getting too expensive. Why would you go to study in the UK when in Germany you can do it for free? And the opposite happened. There has been much more students going to the UK and Australia after the introduction of full cost fee. Partly because students and their parents are calculating persons. They think, well, if I have to pay high money for something, it must be worth, and I will probably get out of it something beneficial. So that has been stimulating much, but also with the aggressive need of universities in those countries to recruit international students because it was related to budget cuts by the government, so they had to compensate for that. But it has had a different aspect, and that's why also later on you see that other countries have been following the same path. At the turn of the century, you see a shift from what we call the more internationalization as being cooperation, so exchange of students, the Erasmus programs, agreements, research collaboration, to competition, what my Dutch colleague Marijke van der Wende called a change of paradigm from cooperation to competition into internationalization of higher education. We started to compete. We started to compete for the best students. We started to compete for most students. We started to compete for the best faculty. We started to compete for positions in rankings. We started to compete for access to to top publications. We started to compete for everything much more than the focus would be on cooperation. You still have to cooperate, and if you cooperate, you also compete, but the essence of the shift was very clearly. We also gradually saw a change of Western dominance to emerging global internationalization after the turn of the century. Still, internationalization and international movement was a Western-dominated concept and strategy. We benefited, and the Global South was not. And you have seen gradually, and now even more, that universities in the Global South were starting to become much more taking their own role. Still in a very marginal way, and to a certain extent, sadly, also copying what we have done in the Global North. But gradually you see a change. You see also in numbers of students, you see a gradual change, and now it will even skyrocket. If you look at what happens over the past few years, and it started already a little bit earlier, but clear that we go back from an economic to a political rationale of driving internationalization. Not in a positive way, more in a negative way, but we see that we are very much inward looking, in particular in the Global North, and we also see that there's much more attention to security, national security, knowledge security issues as driving the internationalization. I come back to that, but that's very directly how you see that dominant rationales have been shifting over periods of time. Because if you look at the past half century, and talking about internationalization, we saw that around the 1990s, internationalization started to develop much more as a concept, as a strategy, and was any more marginal and ad hoc and fragmented. So in the 1990s, the first discussions about what do we mean with internationalization and what is happening happened. And again, as I mentioned yesterday to Simon, OECD played a very important role in that discussions by facilitating that researchers like Jane Knight, myself, and others were working on what does it mean internationalization and higher education in the Global North, but also with Asia and Latin America. Later, with support of the World Bank, we did all kinds of studies to understand what was happening, but to make it more also responding to what we saw what happening in higher education, that internationalization became more central. It has become a strategic agenda both for national and local governments and for institutions. If you look at the surveys that we do with the International Association of Universities, over the several years you now see that probably 3/4 of institutions of higher education in the world have an internationalization strategy and or have included internationalization as part of their overall mission and vision and strategy for higher education. So that's quite substantial. Again, with different answers, explicit or implicit, on why they are doing it and what they are doing, but still it was there. We see that governments have much more internationalization strategies. We see that in Germany, we see it in France, we see it in Denmark, we see it in Canada, we see it in Australia, we see it in many countries like Colombia and others in the Global South, that governments also see, well, we have to be collaborating and competing in the international arena by an internationalization strategy. Can be focused on research, can be focused on sending students abroad, can be on recruitment of students, but there is increasing also a role of governments in that. Even sometimes cities even have strategies for internationalization. It's driven again by all kinds of different rationales and strategies, and what we see is that institutions and governments then take different directions. And they change their directions constantly in relation to their context and what is the political context in the country. Again, clear in the United States, but also in my own home country, the Netherlands, you see that there's shifting context because of political movements, there's shifting context because of economic developments, etc. So it is, again, multifaceted, but also a very evolving process. So if you look at when we talk about internationalization, education abroad, so the mobility side of what we're doing is still the dominant perception of what is internationalization. The mobility of students, the mobility of faculty, the mobility of programs, that all is much more important than when we talk about internationalization at home or the focus on how can we prepare both our local students at home and the international students to be interconnected with what is happening in their work, what is happening in their society. So the internationalization of the curriculum at home, as we call it now. Rankings, unfortunately, also have been very much driving national and institutional strategies. But if you look at rankings, what do they define as being international? It is the number of international students, the number of international faculty, and the number of co-publications with international authors. A very quantitative approach to what is internationalization, without any meaning about the quality of what it is, and also with a very limited perception of what internationalization really means. And so if an agenda by a government or an institution is only, we want to move by internationalization in the rankings, what do? You start to recruit international students, you start to recruit international faculty, and you start to stimulate co-publications. But you don't think about what does it mean for our own programs, what does it mean for our local students. So rankings have a very negative and narrow perception of what is internationalization, and we have seen the dramatic results of that. And the governments who, I've been even involved in several of, before the Ukrainian invasion, in Russia with the so-called 5-100 program, which was a strategy by the Russian government to stimulate that 5 universities would be in the international top 100 rankings. Of course, never successful. They invested millions of dollars into that. But the main focus was we have to have more international students, and we have to have more international faculty and co-publications. But they didn't have the facilities to receive those international students. The international students were even not interested to come otherwise than if they come from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and other Russian-speaking countries. So with very limited impact on the policy. But it narrowed the focus of the institution. So you have to be very careful. We have seen also that internationalization has, over the past decades, increased the inequality between universities from the global south and the global north. The global north was still very much the dominant beneficial of internationalization compared to universities in the global south, which were basically also by their own perceptions looking at how can we have access to the global north but not really defining their own internationalization strategy. But also increasing the fight between the top-ranked institutions, those so-called world-class universities, and the rest of the universities. So you see an increasing divide by internationalization. It has become much more synonymous to marketization and competition, and so inequality and exclusiveness has been really the core of why we are internationalizing in higher education over the past decades. It has become a very elitist and unequal concept. Because the reality is, that many students don't benefit from this. If you focus only on recruitment of international students, it's a very small percentage, and Simon has shown the figures yesterday. For instance, we always talk about the United States as having the largest number of international students. It's only, what was it, 3% or something like that, of the total student population. So the perceptions then are that it's very beneficial to integrate them, but the reality is not happening, and there are many other reasons why it has become very elitist, very few people benefiting and very few institutions. Of course, we have seen also around the turn of the century a counter-reaction to all this, more competitive focus on internationalization. We saw in Europe the internationalization at home movement started in Malmö by the director of the International Office of the University of Malmö, who said correctly, well, we talk about 5% of students going in Erasmus abroad, but what about the other 95%? Should we not have an internationalization strategy that deals also with the 95% of the students? And that movement, I call it a movement, some people think it's a concept, I think it's not a concept, but it is a movement, in itself a very important movement, very essential to shift the paradigm from mobility to the focusing on all students. But that movement has spread all over the world as an idea we have to shift the focus. The same happened basically in the UK and Australia, where in reaction to the fact that they were recruiting so much international students, the question came, but what do we learn them and what do we learn our own students? So we have to focus much more on the internationalization of the curriculum. You see the shift also happening about internationalization as a Western paradigm, which Elspeth Jones and I wrote already some 15 years ago about, and now has become, as mentioned, an important, by Sue Robinson, an important discussion by people like Sean Stein and Andriotti and others, to look into, well, is not internationalization too much of a Western concept? We see also more attention to internationalization of research as an important strategy. Interesting enough, research was also perceived to be international anyway, so you didn't need to have a strategy. But research becomes much more complex, much more international, and so you need to have a strategy how to develop that. So that's another important new dimension that we pay attention to. And then there is what we call the internationalization of higher education for society, the third mission of higher education. So how can internationalization, instead of being much more focused on income generation, marketization, etc., how can it, and of the interest of the institution itself, how can it serve the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations? How can we contribute to society by that? So these are counter-reactions which are there. And you see that even in all kinds of labels that have emerged over the years when we talk about internationalization. There was this feeling that internationalization was seen as too much as a technical operation. I'll come back to that, but the definition of Jane Knight, internationalization as a process of integrating international, intercultural, and global dimensions in the purpose, service, and objectives of higher education. That definition describes basically internationalization is that we are doing much more international. In itself, nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't give you a direction. And people who worked in the field felt, well, we need to be much more normative in what we want to do. So you see the focus, we have to be much more comprehensive, so it should not be fragmented and ad hoc. Intelligent, it has to be much more driven by knowledge, ethical, conscientious, responsible, humanistic, all those kind of terms, and global engagement as an alternative term have been coming up as trying to give a much more normative direction to internationalization. Even to the extent that people like Elspeth Jones and me and others don't think, can we not get rid of that terrible word of internationalization? I think Elspeth, maybe she comes back to that in the next session, said maybe we should call it interculturalization, but even that would be probably not help the problem, and it has become such a common problem. But it reflects the feeling of uncomfortability about what is happening. So there was a clear call to change that. And in 2015, I was leading a study with the International Association of Universities and the European International Education Association for the European Parliament about what is the direction of internationalization for the future. How can we help understand as European Parliament when we get all those proposals by the European Commission for more funding for Erasmus, etc. But what are we talking about? So we did an exercise with experts around the world, and they said, well, internationalization should be less elitist and more inclusive. Mobility is fine, but if it is becoming academic tourism, only at the interest of the individual and not as part of the curriculum and teaching and learning, it's not very effective and it's very elitist. Internationalization should not be a goal in itself and should not be driven only by economic rationales. There's nothing wrong with economic rationales, but there should be others as well. So we basically said we have to update the definition by Jane Knight, which still is, as a description, as I said, useful to say, well, what are we doing? But if you want to give it a more clear normative direction, it has to be intentional. It doesn't go by itself, the process. The process has to be directed by the different stakeholders in higher education and outside. It has to be to improve the quality of what we are doing. Otherwise, why would you do it? Would you only do it to make money? Or would you do it because you like to travel much? No, you have to do it because you want to increase the quality of education and research. You don't have to do it for this very small number of students that are mobile, but you have to do it for all students and for all staff. And you have to make a meaningful contribution to society. So internationalization basically is a change agent to improve the quality of what we are doing in higher education as one of the key instruments to make that happen. So that was that. Is it a changing paradigm that we are doing this? Unfortunately, we still play much more lip service to what we are saying than the reality is. We are still seeing internationalization as something isolated from all the activities that we have to include in what. And this is a quote, I'm not going to repeat it, you can read it from Elsbeth, about how internationalization is basically in everything and should be related to everything, but we don't do that. We still see that, even in the surveys that the International Association of Universities does, that of course we do internationalization at home, of course we have international curriculum, but are we really doing that? You can have big questions about that. And this is very important. I'm coming to an end for, I hope to have some good discussions about it, in the current situation. We see that there are major challenges that are facing our societies, and they all impact higher education and its internationalization. And geopolitical developments, health concerns, SDGs, the continuing competition that we have, nationalism, racism, etc. And we have to ask our key questions. Will internationalization be shaped to change the landscape, to help to solve all those kind of tensions? How are we working on doing that? And so what will be our contribution to do that? That are very fundamental questions. We cannot just observe, we have to be much more active in trying to do that. So we do that in a context which is unfortunately not very positive. We have to realize that. Because political rationales are driving again internationalization process. Knowledge security is key rationale now for national governments and even for institutions on what they are doing in the international arena. They don't want to collaborate if they are not sure that it is not guaranteed. That's, if you look at policies by the European Commission, if you look at policies by national governments in Europe, in the United States, in Australia, they all say international collaboration, only if it's possible, but we have to be sure that we are protecting our knowledge against external foreign interference by espionage, etc., political interventions from abroad. That's a very key driver what is happening in internationalization at the moment, in a very negative way. When we talked about responsible internationalization, which was a term in particular developed by colleagues from Brazil, as internationalization has to be responsible for the societal needs, now that term responsible internationalization is used in a political way to stop internationalization by saying international collaboration should be very carefully looked at. And that's what happens under the Trump administration, but also in many European policies, etc. Anti-immigration, of course, has a negative impact on the movement of international students. Again, we see that even today in the United States, but we see it also in countries like the Netherlands and others, where they are trying to stop the number of international students. We see even a contradiction there between governments that are anti-international, anti-immigration, and the economy that needs international students because of shortage for demographic reasons, by shortage of students that are trained in STEM fields or in health situations that they feel like, oh yeah, but we need those international students, otherwise we will not be able to compete anymore. So that's a tension that you even see in the Trump administration between Musk and other tech companies that say, well, we need international students, but only skilled labor. And the MAGA people who are saying, no, we don't want anybody, even not in Harvard. So that, and we see the same kind of developments in European countries, the contradiction between the needs and the reality of politics. So, again, recruitment and income generation still continues to be a very important factor for why they are recruiting international students. Sylvie mentioned that for the UK. You see that in many institutions in Europe. You see it even by governments. So that continues to be a driver, but it is conflicting with other agendas in the political arena as well. Academic and socio-cultural values are under threat more than ever because of this anti-international, and that is very important. So the relationship between the academic values that we, even in the Tirana communique of the Bologna process, have been confirmed as being essential for European higher education. So autonomy, institutional autonomy, academic freedom, participation of students and staff in governance, but also the responsibilities of academic integrity and responsibility for society, for higher education, and higher education for society. Those are the combined values that we all say are important. But the reality is that academic freedom and institutional autonomy are under very serious threat, even in Europe. Not only in countries like Turkey and Hungary, which are always called as the bad boys, but the reality is it happens in countries like the Netherlands, and it happens in the UK, it happens in France, it happens in Italy, it happens everywhere that we see a degree of lack of academic freedom and institutional autonomy, and that has a negative impact on internationalization as well, because it doesn't allow us. And then we still, and I'm not going into that, the whole artificial intelligence and digitalization, which also has all kinds of opportunities, but also very important challenges for the internationalization of higher education. So, are we, or they, as I used in a recent blog in University World News, undoing internationalization? Yes, I refer to another blog that Chris Klaas, my colleague from Boston College, we said about, if you look into what is happening in the political sphere, in the Cold War, and he used the word belonging, by the way, in that sense, we will give you a space. That was what happened in the Cold War. You can buy a space. That was the whole economic rationale, and they say you must secure a space. So that is basically what is happening, which belonging becomes increasingly more complex and more contradictory. And what we see is that governments and private sector, they're throwing the baby of internationalization away with the bathwater. But we also, as institutions and as practitioners and scholars, we have a role to play. We have to act and not only preach. We have to practice more. As John Hudzik wrote, internationalization, it is indeed under assault, but it's worth fighting for. So that's what we say, and if I make that as a final, international students should not to be seen as a profitable industry. I mean, I'm not against that revenue generation is an important part of higher education. I mean, I have had very intensive discussions again with Elspeth Jones, where she is always my consciousness partner. She said that I was always criticizing the UK and Australia because they were recruiting students for international money without saying, well, is that really bad, or are we talking about other things? I think they're right. I mean, there's nothing against that taxpayers say, well, why would we support rich people from other countries when they come to stay, for instance. But it should not be the driving force. That's not internationalization. The driving rationale should be the academic and social cultural values that should be driving our internationalization strategy. And with that, I end my talk, and I have all references, but you get the PowerPoint and you can read that. Thank you very much.
Much, Hans, for this very insightful presentation. In fact, I think this presentation, your last slide, responds to the question of this conference. Yeah. And it was really important to frame internationalization as a complicated concept and with different rationales and so on. So now I will open the floor to the audience. We have there a question. Thank you.
Hi. So my name is Magda Ferro, and I've been working in internationalization since 2009. And for me, I always thought of my job as making a meaningful contribution to society. It doesn't matter if it's with international students or mobility students. And now, especially since January, where the European Commission changed the definition of responsible internationalization, and as Hans mentioned, I feel a bit lost because all of my life I've been working towards a goal, which was making a meaningful contribution. And now, as you mentioned very well, it seems like the only way we can ensure responsible internationalization is not to internationalize at all and to close ourselves so we can protect ourselves. So this is a question I'm not sure if you're maybe able to answer. If you can help me with this kind of contradiction. So what should we, people working in internationalization, should do? Because we've been working, our mindset was focused on making a meaningful contribution, and now it's about do nothing. So should we shut down all the international offices and say, so from now on, we only work towards ourselves? For me, it's something that's been worrying me because actually I'm at a loss. Everything I believed until now seems to be thrown away, and as you mentioned, is anti-internationalization because it's the only way we can make sure we are safe. I'm not sure if I was clear in my...
No, thank you for that. I think the point is quite clear. I mean, everybody these days who works in international is confused. I mean, the problem is also it's not that simple. I mean, there are all kind of good rationales why we have to be careful about foreign interference and espionage and etc. in international research collaboration. So there's nothing against the fact that we have to be aware about that. But the problem is that increasingly governments try to define by themselves what that means and not leave it to the academic community themselves to check and balance. And there should be support by government, there should be support by intelligence agents, etc., to do that. But for instance, there's now this policies in countries like France and the Netherlands and the UK of screening of international students and international faculty. If that's done by governments and they decide who should be welcome, who not, then it is not anymore neutral. It's not defined by, because there are political reasons then to do that. So you have to leave that to the universities. The universities can ask, well, support for that, but what we see is that whole discussion still about who is responsible for that. And if you have institutional autonomy, if you have academic freedom, you cannot leave that kind of decisions, in my view, to government or government agencies. You have to leave that to the academic community to decide themselves to do that. And if there might be errors made, that can happen, then of course we have to realize that and we have to work on that. But academic collaboration has always been the essence of why we are doing well in our societies. I mean, look at the COVID. I mean, if there would have not been research collaboration internationally, there would have not been vaccines to solve the problem. So academic collaboration is essential, and we have to understand as institutions in our work that there are certain risks related to that, and we have to be aware of that and we have to work on that. But what is happening is that increasingly the European Commission, the governments think that they have to be the control about that, and that's I think the tensions that we see in currently. But and what we have to do in our work, we still have to continue with international activities based on the values that I mentioned. If we are thinking carefully about how important international collaboration is in an integral way, in an ethical way, then I think that should be driving our work. And if we cannot do that, then we have a problem. And we see that university leaders are sometimes struggling between, yeah, but we cannot do all those kind of things, so we have to ask the governments to do that. No, you can ask them for support, but not really you have to decide what is important. So, I perfectly understand the struggle that we all face, and that's, yeah, it's sad, but it's reality.
More questions or comments? So maybe I can ask one question to you. Because when you talk about different rationales, and the academic rationale or the political rationale, I remembered one research I've done in the past because of a relationship between industry and academia, for instance. And when we interviewed students, what we felt was that the relationship between academia and industry, for instance, in an industrial PhD, they felt this contradiction between having to secure knowledge to make it a competitive advantage, and at the same time the requirements of the academia to publish. And so they felt this conflict. Do you think that it is possible to overcome some of these contradictions that you highlighted? Because we are dealing, in fact, with different rationales. Academics have different objectives from governments, for instance.
Yeah, no, it's a classical ethical discussion indeed. And so if we are dependent of contracts for doing research or PhD or even training by industries, and they define the terms of what the research is about and what the outcomes of the research and how they are going to use, then I find that against the academic values that we have, and that's the autonomy and the academic freedom that we should be able to publish whatever the findings are. The reality is that in many countries and many institutions, even including the top world-class universities like Harvard, and so they have been so much obsessed by the fact that they have to have this kind of big research contracts by industry that they are accepting the terms of those kind of industries. And I think that if we start to move in that, continue to move in that direction, then I think it goes against everything what we should be standing for. And that's our freedom to publish whatever we think is the result of our research.
And so the educational, the academic rationale should be, in my view, still be driving what we are doing in everything in higher education.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any more questions? So thank you again, Hans, for this very insightful. And now we'll invite you to join us in the coffee break. We'll have half an hour, and so we'll be back at 11, okay? Thank you.